This is my 100% custom personal tow rope that I designed from the ground up to be able to be set up in minutes, fit in a backpack, and cost less than anything I could find on the internet. Sledding is one of our all-time favorite winter activities for me and my son. Flying down the hill with him, hearing him giggle is the best. It's just that the walk back up the hill is not so much fun. So instead of getting in shape to walk up the hills more easily, I spent a few months and a lot of late nights designing this product to share with you here today. The process nearly took me out, but I think you're gonna like the end result that I came up with. All right, so let's step back to the original design of what I had in mind here. The original design actually leverages something called a capstan winch. Now, these mechanisms are really cool because they actually allow you to tow infinite amounts of rope because it doesn't coil on the spool itself. Not only that, but it never loses mechanical advantage like a traditional winch would. So to understand if this concept was actually going to work, I first had to 3D print every single component of this design. Not only just to test the mechanisms, but I also wanted to see if this thing would actually hold up in practice with 100% 3D printed enclosure components without having to machine anything. So the guts of this are actually pretty simple. It's just a beefy brushless motor with a 3-to-1 gearing that allows us to get a little bit more torque out of this using a belt drive. Then everything is completely enclosed for safety, and I actually just printed these 3D printed plates with the threads in them, and they actually went together just fine without any sort of heat set inserts. Then I took advantage of the D-shaped axle here to slide on this drum without the need for any additional mounting hardware. Once the drive mechanism was together, I could then mount the handle, which we'd also then use to mount the battery to. In this case, we're actually gonna use some hot swappable 18-volt Milwaukee power tool batteries. I could then use some software called VESC tool to program the electronic speed controller to drive and control the brushless motor here. I could then use the rest of my hodgepodge leftover PLA filament to complete the enclosure of the capstan winch itself, and I actually just used some draw latches to snap this all together. So the general idea is pretty simple. You just wrap the rope around the capstan pulley here a few times, and then theoretically, you can just pull the trigger and apply some tail tension, and it should just work, right? I was absolutely wrong. I actually found out that with this design, the rope would coil way too easily, leading to a bunch of snags when I was actually trying to use this thing. Out of desperation, I really tried to make this design work, but after a few tests, it just was clear to me that this was gonna be way too finicky to work in the field. But these failures actually led me to my next idea about how we could fix this. Now, before we get into how I fixed it, I wanna take a second and thank this video's sponsor, PCBWay. Now, unlike the name might suggest, PCBWay not only produces custom printed circuit boards for makers like us, but they also offer 3D printing, sheet metal, and machining services. All you have to do is go to PCBWay.com, upload your files, and you can get instant quotes for any project that you might have in progress. Now, with that in mind, I just got my parts, so let's check out how they turned out. And I gotta hand it to PCBWay on this one. Even though these parts are made of metal, they made sure that these things were wrapped super, super snugly. That is nice. Look at that. If you wanna see this enhanced version of the personal tow rope using these metal plates from PCBWay, stick around to the very end. All right, so let's talk about how we're gonna salvage this design. So instead of relying on a capstan winch design, I decided to pivot and use something that's actually called a power ascender. So traditionally you would see arborists and rock climbers use a design like this, but instead of hauling us purely vertically, we're just gonna use this to haul us up the hill. It's actually much simpler, and it just features one pulley with teeth on it where you actually wrap the rope around, and then it uses the teeth and friction to bite into the rope and pull you along the rope. And I was so confident in this design, but the moment I pulled the trigger expecting it to just yank me forward, nothing happened. It just started slipping on the rope again. And I'm not gonna lie, this is when morale hit an all-time low. This is when I decided to add way more aggressive teeth on the pulley to see if this would ultimately do the trick. I find that this is the most ergonomic position to do this work in. Oh! Ah. All right, figure that out later. So
seems like it wants to pull now. That's great. But it can't overcome any sort of resistance I put on it. So we have to figure out a way to grab harder. We'll figure it out.
And figure it out we did. What I decided to do here was actually have the rope enter from the front and leave from the front for maximum grip on this internal pulley. I could then let another printing marathon begin. So while that was in progress, I decided it was time to beef up our VESC. So what I'm actually doing here is applying a conformal coating to ensure if any moisture gets into the enclosure, it won't harm the VESC. And once that was done, we're ready to lay out all of our components for a final assembly. All in all, this really isn't too complex. It was just the devil in the details that almost killed me on this one. So you may have been wondering how I was actually controlling the VESC, and actually what I'm using here is what's called an ADC input, which you would typically actually find on like e-bikes. This specific one was actually perfect because it kind of resembles a trigger, which fit really nicely in the handle. I could then add our Milwaukee battery adapter to the bottom to make swapping batteries incredibly easy on the fly. I then had to swap the provided fuse with the battery adapter with one of these more low profile ones to fit in the handle. Once that was complete, I could glue the VESC into place. The design is intended to allow you to swap the fuse if absolutely needed as well. You just need to cut some wires to length. I've also found it to be really important to test these components every step of the way so you don't get all the way to the end of the assembly only to find out that you messed something up. So for this next iteration, I actually decided to print all the components in PETG, which if you're not familiar with the alphabet soup of these 3D printing filaments, PETG is really nice because it prints almost as easily as PLA, but it's UV resistant and resists moisture a lot better than PLA. Once that was assembled, I could then recalibrate the motor one more time and add a few more components for the final assembly. And it was at this point that I realized if this didn't work, I had no idea what the heck I was gonna do next.
Let's go! Yes! It works! Whoa, okay, I just snapped something. Yeah, it's got like serious power too now. That is so cool! Ah, it works! Oh, yes!
So once I was done with my little happy dance there, I could cut the axle down to length so that it was no longer sticking out, and then I just filed it down to get rid of sharp edges. And then once I verified that everything was still working smoothly, the next thing to do was to take this outside with our 500 feet of rope we got off Amazon and test it on some level ground with my son, who would ultimately be the one who would be pulling up the hill with this thing.
Loop it around. All right, now.
After one quick go, my son decided that he had had enough sledding, so the only logical thing for me to do was to trade him places so I could be the guinea pig next. I had originally designed this for a 25-pound toddler, not a 160-pound man, so I was skeptical.
It's working!
With my confidence building, it was time to pack it up and bring it to the sled hill so we could put it through its paces and see exactly how much this can haul. Now, I could have just thrown it in a backpack, but the Pelican case made it feel way more official. With my toddler in hand, it was time to bring all of our gear back up to the hill where this idea originally started. If you've ever spent an appreciable amount of time on a project, you know that this part of the process is always so nerve-wracking. All of the hard work, late nights, and failed attempts were coming to this point to see if our little invention would actually work the way we think it would. For our first test, let's grab a random log that we found lying around to see if it'll haul this up without an issue. More than the weight itself, I just wanted to make sure that there was no weird issues with coiling the rope, spooling it in, or spooling it out before we added some real weight. So before I offered my son to get into it, I wanted to send it even farther down to make sure it would haul up okay, and then it was time to ask my son if he wanted to go for a ride.
Jack, do you want to go on the tow rope?
No.
You don't want to go? Okay.
Thank God I brought a plan B. So let's start with 25 pounds, which is roughly the weight of my 2-year-old. It was immediately clear that this tow rope would have no issue hauling my son up the hill when he decides that he actually wants to go for a ride. So it was time to up the ante and double the weight to 50 pounds. Even at 50 pounds, our tow rope didn't seem to have an issue at all. Now things are getting serious. Let's up the ante and put 95 pounds in our sled. And even at 95 pounds, our tow rope didn't seem to break a sweat on the way up. So at this stage, I was done letting an empty sled with dead weight have all the fun. I figured instead of standing at the top of the hill with the tow rope fixed, I could fix the rope at the top of the hill and actually have the tow rope move with me, in essence, creating a ski lift I could take anywhere. So it was back to the mom-mobile to grab my planks, throw on my boots, and see if this would actually be able to haul me up the hill. It was a balmy 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so I decided it was time to go full Jerry with my jeans on and my ski boots just for extra style points. Once the rope was locked in, I could squeeze the trigger and let her rip. And against all odds, this little personal tow rope actually started hauling me up the hill. Now, I'm not going to pretend like this is going to break any land speed records or it didn't struggle a lot in the middle of the hill, but I think with the right updates to the gearing, this thing could really haul well. So this is where you smart people come in watching this video. I'm going to leave all the files in the description of this video below so that you can print these off and even build this if you want to, and I encourage you to do a better job than I did. All I ask in return is that you like this video and subscribe to the channel because it costs you absolutely nothing and it helps family-friendly, honest DIY content like this grow in popularity. So once all the festivities were wrapped up, the other amazing part about this design is that you can also use it to spool up the rope in your bag so that you don't have to haul it in by hand. So that's gonna do it for this one, you guys. Drop a comment below on what you think I could have done better. Download the files, build it yourself, get outside, go have fun, and I'll see you in the next build. And if you want to know what this personal tow rope looks like with actual metal plates machined from 6061 aluminum, check it out.